We'd now like to welcome from Chambers Ireland Mr. Shane Conneely, Director of Policy and Communications.
Gurma, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation today. And in particular, thank you to the lay members of the audience here for giving so much of your time to this process. I'm a big fan of the format of the Citizens' Assembly. They've proven to be a very strong tool for having nuanced and complicated conversations. Chambers Ireland, which I'm part of, have a lot of engagement at the European level through Eurochamber. And we're constantly hearing back about the Irish model of citizens' assemblies, and when it comes up, it's spoken of in glowing terms. Personally, I'm going to be treading a careful pathway here today between all the wonderful ideas that I have about the directly elected mayor, as a political nerd, as someone who grew up in Firhouse, as someone who's lived within the canals for the last 10 years. I have lots of my own opinions, but I'm here to communicate the positions of our local chambers. I'm also aware that I'm coming to you at the end of or towards the end of a long process. I'm not going to pretend that I have all the answers for you. At this stage, you guys will be amongst the most expert in the country on this issue. In this presentation, I'll take you through the following elements from the perspective of the broader business community. In a scene setting, explain who Chambers Ireland are, where we think we are with respect to the directly elected mayor. Right now, we'll go through the concerns of our network, what the aspirations for directly elected mayors would be should they be introduced, and finally ask you the hard questions which I hope you'll be able to answer in your report. So kind of loosely speaking, we're a grassroots organisation, we're a business organisation, and we are geographically based. What this means is that as a grassroots organisation that spans the business community throughout the island and is in every single major city and town, with a couple of exceptions, our local chambers map onto the local authority areas, though some places like Clare and Mayo tend to have multiple smaller units. In contrast, some of the bigger chambers span a couple of local authority areas, so I'd be thinking of Galway, Cork, Dublin in that space. And Dublin is a special case with 4 chambers in the county. Dublin Chamber is the longest running chamber, but there's also Fingal, South Dublin and Dunleary right down. Just to follow up on kind of Dr. Reedy's observations earlier on, half of all local government spending happens in Dublin each year. It's about 2.3 billion. 720 million of that is funded by the businesses that are in Dublin, so that is local funding. And for all the discussion that happens about LPT, local property tax, every year, I think 47 million was raised in 2020. It is not a significant share of the spending. What happens at local government level is that there is the services they provide for central government locally. There's decisions that councillors make in terms of what services will be put on top of that. There is the decision about how much to tax at the local property level, and then the gap. And that gap is about 30+% of total spending of all kind of grants comes from the businesses that are there on the ground. If there is one particular, as a lobbyist, it's one thing that I'd like you to think about. It's that there's an exemption for government buildings from paying property taxes, and that particularly affects Dublin. So when things happen like the Bank of Ireland building gets redeveloped on Baggot Street and gets turned into a series of departments, it stops being taxed, and that's revenue that Dublin City Council no longer gets. And given the concentration of government buildings within a lot of Dublin, that actually affects how much can be spent in the county considerably. So again, scene setting, we have about 8,000 business members nationally, another 2,000 plus members which are in the voluntary NGO sector. From the biggest firms in the country to the very smallest, there's a place for every business in our network, and it's a place that marks us out. Our chambers are everywhere, our chambers are geographically focused, and we want to have local healthy economies thriving around the country. That's what puts us into this conversation about directly elected mayors. More than most business organisations, we are the local business organisation. We are the ones that are on the ground. So as grassroots organisations, we come in, so Chambers Ireland comes in whenever there's a consensus across our network. We did not take a view on the plebiscites. Our local chambers took their own positions. Limerick and Cork were in favour. Waterford had mixed views. There was very little political support across the country for the plebiscites to pass. The local authorities themselves pushed back. A lot of the councils were against it. The results were marginal. Our sense is that if there had been a stronger push from the parties earlier, all three would have passed. For business at the moment, how do we feel about the prospect of directly elected mayors? Well, there's three big problems for businesses right now. There's housing availability for talent and energy costs and security. It is very hard to see how directly elected mayors will tackle those particular problems. From the members that I talked to, there is no consensus that directly elected mayors will solve the problems of the business community. There is a sense that the directly elected mayor is probably a good thing in principle, but there's also the sense that there will be an enormous amount of institutional resistance to them. You'll have had Tim O'Connor into yesterday, and as you'll know, there's a lot of support for a directly elected mayor in Limerick. That comes with a couple of caveats. Limerick wants to see a directly elected mayor which is coupled with local authority reform. Limerick City would appreciate having a responsive directly elected mayor implementing policy locally, and Limerick Chamber supports decentralisation as a principle of the principle of subsidiarity, along with most of our members. Limerick Chamber is very interested in the directly elected mayor having responsibility over transport and infrastructure. However, there's no consensus that what is appropriate for Limerick will be appropriate for everywhere. And that said, there's a general kind of held belief that decision making should be made at the lowest level, at the most effective level, and that would secure kind of local buy-in more easily and help deconflict different policy aims. And finally, kind of within that space, kind of across all our chambers, there's the belief that whatever happens with Limerick, the model will be extended across other cities with a slightly tailored version for Dublin. So the meat of our discussion today is the concerns that we have about this role. There's little consensus about what we ought to do, but there's an awful lot of consensus about what the concerns regarding a directly elected mayor are. There's a very strong sense that if what we end up at the end of this process is a largely ceremonial position, some kind of Lord Mayor ++, then this process will have failed. All our chambers acknowledge that there is a risk that these mayors could become seats of the disaffected, the way our MEP seats can be sometimes. It's possible that people who are against government might have an easier time in getting elected to a role like the directly elected mayor, but that's one of the risks of democracy. It's an argument against the democratic process. It's not necessarily an argument against directly elected mayors. The meaty problem is of resources and autonomy. If mayors cannot raise money locally, and local authorities have been very, very bad at raising revenue locally, just look at the local property taxes, then the role will be constrained by central government, and the success of the mayors will be decided upon by the ministers sitting in the day. There will likely be tension between mayors and ministers, and conflicts between the departments that don't want to let go of power and resources. So the execution of powers and duties, if there is to be a directly elected mayor for Dublin, will require authority and autonomy. These powers have to be set out explicitly in legislation, or the role will be starved of resources in the event of there being political tension between a government of the day and the mayor of the day. And mayors don't have the capacity, and if mayors don't have the capacity to influence policy like policing, education, transport decisions, there's a very real question as to what the mayor is actually for. If as a mayor your capacity to deliver on your electoral programme for your city is reliant on others facilitating it, then there's a risk that they become a political mudguard to protect actual decision makers. And again, the more cynically minded within the network have suggested that weak mayors are being proposed as an alternative to real reform at the regional level. So if these are the problems, why are we here? Well, There is support for the idea of directly elected mayors. Primarily, this is because there seems to be a problem of political accountability when it comes to decision making. Those who like the idea of mayors seem to like it because there will be a focal point for decision making which will be politically accountable to the residents. Our cities and towns are struggling with the very real problems in terms of vacancy, disastrous underinvestment in infrastructure, very poor planning. There's a huge amount of work to be done with public realm and quality of life, but a directly elected mayor would need to have the powers and means to deliver on those objectives. It is thought that there is an opportunity within this process to commence real local government and metropolitan government reform that could remedy these problems that our cities face. And finally, there's also the ambassadorial role for the mayors to help channel investment, to help channel jobs into local areas, though that wouldn't be enough to justify the role. The role needs to have real executive decision-making authority. So my questions for you. Most people in our network seem to think that there's an issue with democratic accountability and decision-making through our government. The principal question is that if the problem is democratic unaccountability, is a directly elected mayor the right way to solve this? There's a great line from Yes Prime Minister about, it's called the politician's syllogism. When you encounter a problem, we must do something. This is something, therefore we must do this. And it has to be asked about the directly elected mayor. There's a risk that if the alternative to a directly elected mayor is doing nothing, we'll just go down the path of a directly elected mayor, even if there's better, more appropriate solutions. And again, the cynical within the network have suggested that we are treading down this path to avoid introducing real reforms across all levels of government. The second problem is subsidiarity. The challenge of finding the right level of decision making for Dublin is a real question. The real question is what subsidiarity would look like within a metropolitan area with multiple local governments, and how do we deliver that? As it is, we have local area committees that discuss very local problems at the ward level, as it once was called. But resolving those problems currently requires the chief executive to take action. As is, the councillors have very little real power to resolve the problems that they discuss and determine. Would introducing another level of authority above them again undermine local decision making even more? Perhaps reintroduction of town councils would be useful in lieu of or in combination with the directly elected mayors. And finally, the big question is, how do we finance the role without the success of the mayor being dependent on their relationship with government? Can they be given the autonomy and the resources they need to avoid being mere figureheads? So these are not easy questions, and thank you so much for taking so much of your time to consider them and how they can be addressed. And I'd have to concur with what Averick said. If you're considering compromising, don't. Go big. Gurma.